All right. Well, again, we're glad you're here. Those of you online, thanks for being a part of our experience today. Hey, here's the deal. Just get this out of the way. This series has challenged me, and this week, I believe this message will be maybe even a little more challenging than any other message in the series to date. And so just right now, just be ready to maybe be offended a little bit, okay? Just embrace for it now. So when it happens in the moment, you'll be like, he told me he was going to offend me on some level today. So online as well, just be ready. This word will challenge you as it has challenged me today as well. If you've missed any of these messages in the series, I'd encourage you to go back and watch. You're in chapter 5 of a series of a book, and not all of these, I don't have time to recap. They all build upon each other, so it's important for you to go back and catch up on that. I have a question for you that I want you to consider throughout the message today, and it's this question right here. What do you do when you're the most powerful person in the room? What do you do when you're the one in charge? When you're calling the shots, when what you say goes? It's final. What do you do when you're the most powerful person in the room? I think that one of the greatest signs of maturity that we have, not even as Christ followers, but just as human beings, is how and what we do with our influence. It's a great sign of maturity in how you handle the influence that you have. I think there's probably few things more infuriating than a leader who leverages their influence for their own gain. In fact, a leader who leverages their influence even at the expense of those following them. That's not a leader that we would look up to. It's not a leader that we would want to follow. It's not a leader, hopefully, that we would want to be. When a leader leverages the authority, the power, the influence that they have, not for those who are following them, but for themselves. But on the flip side of that, I think there's few things more admirable than a leader who leverages their power, their authority, the giftings that God has given them, not for themselves, but for the sake of those following them. That's a leader we want to follow. That's someone that we want to be ourselves. How many of you have seen the TV show, What Would You Do? Anybody seen that online? You've seen the TV show? If not, let me explain it to you. Unless some of you, maybe your armpits stink, you weren't willing to raise your hand or something. But I'm guessing not many of you have seen the show then by the raise of hands in the room, maybe online the same way. But essentially the show is this. It's kind of like Candid Camera, but in a sense that they're not just pulling practical pranks. They're putting people in situations where there's either a tense moment, there is someone being mistreated, and you're seeing it, you're watching it play out live, whether it be in a restaurant and a couple is fighting and the man gets just, very loud and rude and people, they don't film what's happening, they film the people listening or watching what's happening, and you see their reactions and they're like, and they go, what would you do if you were in that situation? Or sometimes they'll entrap people with somebody drops a large sum of money and someone sees it and picks it up and it's like, what are you gonna do? You going to run them down and be like, hey, you dropped this, or are you going to put it in your pocket for yourself? What would you do? And they film the people, and then eventually they respond to them and say, hey, this was a joke, but hey, what would you do? Then they kind of interview them. And that's the question today, again, that we're answering, that we're thinking about. But the reality is that no one really knows what they would do until you are the most powerful person in the room, until you're in the situation. Until you've been given the keys to the organization, until you've been put in the position that people have to listen to you, they have to follow you. You don't really know what you will do until you're in the situation. And David, finally, where we left him off last week, finds himself in the position where after 15 years of waiting to become king, to see the promise of God fulfilled in his life, he is finally the most powerful person in the room. Back to 2 Samuel chapter 5, 1 through 3. It says, then all the tribes of Israel went to David at Hebron, and they told him, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, when Saul was our king, you were the one who really led the forces of Israel. And the Lord told you, you will be the shepherd of my people, Israel. You will be Israel's leader. So there at Hebron, King David was finally made king, and it says that he made a covenant before the Lord with all the elders of Israel, and they anointed him to be king of Israel. So David finally finds himself in the position where he's not just the most powerful person in the room, he's the most powerful person in a nation full of people. What would David do now that he holds all the power, all the authority, he has all the influence? And even in this small few verses of scripture here, there's some key words that sometimes we can just skip over. But first it said that David made a covenant before the Lord. A covenant was a contract. It was a promise, and it was agreement. And today it would literally be like you sign a contract, an agreement that you are going to live up to certain standards. And not only does he do this, before the people, an agreement with the people, David said that he made a covenant with the Lord. He was essentially signing an agreement of how he was going to lead now that he is king of all Israel. And David applies all the lessons that he'd been learning in this waiting season, in the 15 years of difficulty, of challenges, and many of them on the run, fending for his own life and trying to escape the wrath of Saul. And David applies these principles. He shows his true greatness, and he continues to lead with the characteristics that we identified right at the beginning: humility, accountability, and dependency upon the King of Kings, upon God. Before the Lord, David recognized in public with all the people that he would be a king under authority. That even though he was over people, he would still be under God. That he would still lead with that type of humility and character because he was dependent upon the King of Kings. Remember, David is around people that essentially had been a part of Saul's leadership and his kingdom and his group of people, and they put David in this position that he was on the run. These 12 elders of the tribes, they're coming to him, and David literally, now we know you're in charge. David could have just dropped the hammer on him and been like, look how you treated me the last 8 years. You were in Saul's, you're on Saul's, you're done. You're out of the kingdom. I'm not going to do that. Instead, he makes an agreement with them, a covenant with them before God of how he himself was going to continue to submit to God's law and the people which he would rule over. David lived this life from the very beginning, from week 1 of this series. We said David lived in a way with all of his flaws, all of his mistakes, all the times that he messed up. He still realized, I am a king, but I'm not the king. That I am under authority, and I will continue to lead with instruction from God's word. I will continue to submit to God's will, and I will follow God's way. In case you forgot, many of you probably did, last week, right? David had this idea, this conviction that I will obey the word of God. I will believe the promises of God. I will submit and surrender to the will of God while I trust the ways of God in the timing of God. David led this way, and David had learned these lessons throughout by watching Saul, by watching others in leadership, that leadership is stewardship. That leadership we find in Scripture is something that God gives to someone, that any influence, any authority, any power you have is because God has given it to you. And he expects you, in fact, we're going to see today, requires from you that you steward that responsibility in a way not for your own gain, not just to build your kingdom, but to build God's. That leadership is stewardship, and that even kings are accountable to God. Now listen, if you're a Christian, this kind of greatness that we see in David isn't meant just to inspire us. And today, please, I hope by the end of this, you don't just feel inspired today, but that you will see that this kind of greatness, this kind of humility, this kind of leadership Someone who stewards the influence and the things that God has given them in a way and leverage them in a way not for their own sake, but for the sake of those who are following them isn't just meant to inspire us, it's required from us. It's required. It's a requirement for Christ followers. All right, how many of you have seen Braveheart before? Hopefully a little better than, oh, so much better now. William Wallace, come on somebody. There ain't nothing, if William Wallace doesn't move you, you got some problems. Right? Maybe it's not, it's Maximus, the gladiator, right? Ruler of the armies of the north, husband to a murdered wife, father to a murdered son. And I will take my vengeance in this life or the next. Come on, somebody, that doesn't get you excited today. I don't know what will. Maximus, I literally saw that movie on and I go, I can't wait till I can watch this with my son. I wanted to name you Maximus and Maddox had to settle, I had to settle for Maddox, Jess was like, we're not naming him Maximus. He was a gladiator that killed people, Anyways, so, but there's something about these movies that stand the test of time, right? It doesn't matter. You'll be scrolling through TV, you got nothing to watch, and you're like, I'm just going to watch Gladiator for the 800th time. I know what's going to happen, but there's something about it that's moving, right? There's something about William Wallace who says, you can take my life, but you can't take my freedom. There's something about these characters that draws us in, that makes us want to be like them. That we all would hope when faced with the same challenges that we would handle the situation the same way, with character, with courage, that we would do that. But what inspired us about these characters is that they were leaders that leveraged their influence, not for themselves, but for the sake of everyone around them. That's what inspires. That's what motivates people. And I'm telling you, church, today, it's what's going to motivate this lost world. Leaders, Christ followers, who leverage their influence, their skills, their gifts, their resources for a kingdom that's far greater than their own. It's what inspired Jesus' disciples to be willing to be martyred for their faith in him. That they followed him to the point of death even after he was gone, because they saw in Jesus this type of leadership. They saw in Jesus this type of person. In fact, it's about 1,000 years later after David is anointed king at Hebron, just 20 miles north in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus, our king, would pave a path that wouldn't just inspire all Christians, but would be required from everyone who signs up to follow him. And in John 13:1, it says, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he was loving them until the very end. So this is Jesus' Last Supper. Many of you are familiar with the story. You've probably seen the painting. They're celebrating Passover when God showed grace and mercy to his people as he was delivering them from Egypt. And they're celebrating these historical moments of their faith. And Jesus is taking this moment to pause with his disciples. They had no idea what he was going to do the next day, that he would go to the cross and be crucified for their sins. And so in their mind, it's just another meal with Jesus. But Jesus uses this final moment with his disciples and all the teachings, all the miracles that he had done, all the miraculous things that they had witnessed Jesus do, literally heal the blind and the deaf and the lepers and raise Lazarus from the dead. They witnessed all of this. This had already all taken place, and here's Jesus. And it comes down to this final moment. It's one last meal with his disciples. What will Jesus say? What will he do? Considering that he was leaving the keys to the kingdom to them. What would he do in this final moment? Like David, Jesus had been anointed but not recognized yet. He too would initiate this new covenant between God and all mankind, but not with the blood of an animal sacrifice, but with his own blood. Goes on, it says, Jesus, in verse 3, knew that the Father had given him authority. If you're sitting next to your neighbor, why don't you say the word authority real quick? Authority. It's the word that I mentioned earlier. It's the word that we admire when a leader uses their authority, not for their own sake, but for the sake of those following him. Jesus had been given authority over everything. And it said that he knew that he had authority over everything, that he had come from God and he was going back to be with God. Think about that. Jesus, the Son of God, the sinless Son of God, who healed lepers, raised the dead, taught with authority, with intuition, with amazing leadership, where he had amassed this great following of people. And here he is with those closest to him, his disciples. Not in an identity crisis, not forgetting who he was. It said he knew exactly who he was. He knew the power he had. He knew the influence he had. He knew what he could demand from them at this moment in history. But instead of leveraging his authority to his own gain, it says he got up from the table. He took off his robe, which is significant because a rabbi would wear a robe that identified them as a teacher, as the one in authority. So essentially, before his students, his disciples, the rabbi takes off his robe and they're going, what is Jesus doing? And not only that, he picks up a towel and he pours water into a basin. And at this point, the disciples are starting to figure out what Jesus is getting ready to do. And Peter goes, no way. No way, Jesus, you're not going to do it. I've seen what those hands can do. They are certainly not about to do what I think you're going to do. And Jesus tells him to sit down. And he picks up his towel, he pours water into a basin, and then he begins to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around his waist. Jesus has the power without the crown, the authority at this point without the title, yet he's holding all the cards. He knew who he was, and when he literally was the most powerful person in the room, Jesus laid down his rights as the Son of God for the sake of others. He takes off his robe, he grabs a towel, and he washes his disciples' feet. What do you do when you're the most powerful person in the room? Jesus' example is he laid down his rights, what was owed to him, for the sake of others. Jesus then leveraged his authority that God had given him, not just what man had given him, what God had given him, for the sake of others. And the traitors and the rebels who are around the table with him, instead of demanding to be served for the death that he would endure for them, he washes their feet. He washes Judas's feet. And for us, maybe it's not picking up a towel in this season. Maybe it's putting on a mask. I told you right at the beginning. I already told you. You see, can I be honest with you for a second? I got to be careful how honest I am because these are going out live. I was reminded last week. Can't be so honest, Pastor. We can't go back and edit these podcasts anymore. Can I just be honest? I have a point of view about this pandemic. Just like you. I have a point of view. I have my own opinions about this pandemic, about the virus, about Ohio State football being canceled. I got an opinion. You have an opinion. We all have opinions. But it's not about what I think about this pandemic. It's not about what I think about this virus. It's not about what I think about kids being in school or out of school, about capacity at restaurants. And can I be honest that I have a political point of view, just as a human being? That I have my own political views about how I would like to see things go or not go. And I have my views. But you know what? My views don't matter because of you. Because God has called me as the shepherd of this church not to leverage my platform and my influence for my point of view, but for His. And I will never make a point at the expense of making a difference in someone's life. I will never leverage my influence at the sake of potentially isolating someone and pushing them outside of my influence. Because God has called me to leverage everything that I have for His kingdom, not mine. To build what He wants to do, what He wants to accomplish through me, not me. And so I have a point of view. I have an opinion. But it doesn't really matter. Because I'm not called to do what's best for me. God's called me to do what's best for you. And I shepherd a very diverse group of people. Politically, how they view things, how they view a virus. And never would I want to isolate anyone in this flock because of what I think, because of what I want. Because it's not about me, right? That was what we love about David. He didn't live a way that was about him. It was about those God put in His leadership. So, with that said, you saw we're going to 3 services again. Praise God, we're running out of room. I never would have thought we'd be running out of room in 2 services at 250 people, but here we are. Because we have 150 chairs stacked in the lobby over here so that we can try to keep people as spread out as possible. Never did I think we would need to do 3 services to reach 300, 400 people when we were doing 3 services to reach 900 people before this all started. But here we are. More people are coming back, and we need to make room for them. It demands more from our staff, from our team, from our volunteers, all of those things. And what we're going to do, because I've had conversations with people in our family, your brothers, your sisters, who say, Pastor, I want to come back to church, but because not everybody wears a mask, I don't feel comfortable in the room. So you know what? I'm not going to do anything based on my point of view or your point of view. I'm going to do not what's best for everybody, but what's best for those who want to be in the room. How many of you are thankful you're in the room? That you're back at church, right? It's a good thing, and we want to extend that to everybody. And so the 8:30 service we're going to have, and we're going to be opening up more kids' rooms. Come on, somebody, right? Your kids won't have to sit with you all service, right? We're going to create more room. But at the 8:30 service time, it will be required if you're in the room to wear a mask. Because we want to make our brothers and sisters feel comfortable. We're going to use our influence in a way to help everyone, not just ourselves. Jesus showed us true leadership by leveraging what He had for the sake of those He had authority over. And Jesus, with His disciples, preached the most powerful message He ever preached to them. And then He gives us this instruction. Verse 12, it says, after washing their feet, He put on His robe again. He sat down and He asked them, do you understand what I was doing? And His disciples said, no, because they never understood what Jesus was doing. And so He didn't even give them time to answer. He says, you call me teacher and Lord, you're right, because that's what I am. He said, I do have authority over you. I am in a position of power and influence. That's who I am. And so since I, your Lord, your teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. And Jesus, according to the Gospels, has this final moment with them. And He says, now you go and do as I've done to you. And then just a few hours later, he would die on a cross for their betrayal, for their denial, for their abandonment. And he looks at him and he says, and you don't do it because people deserve it, because you boys here, you certainly don't deserve what I just did for you. You do it because that's what I've done for you. And in the moments when we begin to think we're something or somebody, and if I can just be transparent, I have those moments too. When I think I'm the most important person in the room, when God gives you an opportunity to be put in a position of power, Jesus says you should do what I have done for you. And look for some feet to wash. Look for some people to serve. And perhaps the greatest indicator of our maturity, of my maturity, is how we handle the authority, the power, and the influence that God has given to each one of you. In church, this can't be optional for us. Not now, especially not now, but not ever. Jesus has given you a responsibility to leverage everything that you have. Your power, your authority, your influence for the sake of others. Last week I was driving home from work and my kids are still at an age when they get excited when dad comes home. Dads, that you've lived past that stage, I'm sorry. It's a grieving moment, I know. So I pull into the drive, my kids were outside playing, there's some other kids from the neighborhood playing, and I pull in just like I always do, and they get excited and they run up. I get my car in the garage and they come up to the door, give me a hug. Dad, you're home, yeah, hey. You know, and I get out and the kids who were in the driveway playing with my kids, they were gone. They left. And I kind of have that reputation in the neighborhood, you know, like when he shows up, we leave, you know, like I don't know what it is. I kind of like it though, to be honest with you. You know, these kids are scared of me for some reason, and so they're gone, you know, and Maddox is kind of like teary-eyed in his face a little bit, and him and Riley are having a discussion, and I walk over. I said, what's going on? Well, they didn't want to play hide and seek the way we wanted to play hide and seek, and so we were saying we should play in this yard and that yard, and they said there's not that many people, we should just play in this yard, but they know all the hiding places in this yard, so it wasn't fun, so we're mad at each other, wanting to get what they want, and then when you pulled up, they said, isn't your dad a pastor? And they said, yeah. And they go, well, we think Christians are doofuses. And so they told me, I go, well, they're doofuses. No, I didn't say that. That's what I wanted to say. And I was like, buddy, doofus. I was like, who, what does doofus even mean? That's not a big deal. Don't even worry about it. And I go inside, and they'd gone in. I changed clothes. They had talked to Jess about it, and they were still just upset about it. They were struggling with it, and so we sit down for dinner, and Jess reads them this passage before we pray for our dinner, Matthew 5, 11 through 12. She says, God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things about you because you are my followers. In fact, be happy about it. Be very glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. So we read this. I look at my kids and I said, do you guys understand what Jesus is saying here to us? I said, what he's saying is, he says, if we live for a purpose that's far greater than this world, and that someday we're going to be in heaven, and when we respond to people who don't think like us, and don't have the same values of us, and don't really respect us, when we respond to them with grace and love and kindness, that Jesus sees that. And that he says, you're not just going to get, may not get what you want right here and right now, but someday when you get to heaven, that he's going to reward you. for responding to people the way that he did? And I said, kids, I said, look at me real quick. I said, do you understand that? And with tears in her eyes, Riley said, yes, Daddy, but it's just so hard to do. And I said, I know it is, sweetie. I said, but the thing is that God is going to help you do it, even when you can't do it. Because Jesus hung on a cross. He was mocked. His face was spit in. He was beaten, crucified. And you know what he did? He didn't say a word. He remained silent. And then he took it a step further and prayed for the very ones who had nailed him to the cross. For some of you in this season, maybe the best way to serve our community in this world, in this politically charged, tense, pandemic environment and culture we're living in, is just not to say anything, not to share the post, not to comment on the post, not to even make a post yourself on your social media. But to say, I'm not going to do anything to jeopardize the influence that God has given me to promote and to proclaim the greatest message ever, the gospel. Because Jesus said more in that moment in his silence than he did in all the other sermons and parables he taught. And when he prayed for the ones who were nailing him to the cross, he leveraged every bit of influence, authority, and power that he had as he endured the worst death that we could ever imagine. Not for himself, but for your sake and for mine. As the band comes and we close out, I'm telling you, all of us in this room have influence. You have influence with people. Maybe it's just your family. Maybe it's just your kids. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a neighbor. And we would do well to embrace the greatness that David learned the hard way and that Jesus modeled for us. And when we're the most powerful person in the room, leverage your power for the benefit of those in the room. When you're the most powerful person in the boardroom and you're at the head of the table in the seat, you don't leverage that moment for you. You leverage it for everyone else sitting around the table. You don't just think about how it benefits you. You think about how it benefits everyone that God has given you influence over. When you're in the living room of your home with your wife and with your kids, Dad, you don't leverage your authority to get what you want. You lay down your rights and you leverage your authority for the sake of those in the room. When you're in the schoolroom, the classroom, the KIDVENTURE room, whatever room you find yourself in, we have an opportunity to leverage everything that God has given us for his kingdom. David said, I am a king, but I'm not the king. And we all serve the king. And it's not just to inspire us today, it's required from us that his kingdom, the king's kingdom, comes before ours. In whatever way that looks like in your life. In Mark 10:45, Jesus said, for even the Son of Man, the Son of God, did not come to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, what inspires us about William Wallace and Maximus, these characters, these superheroes, and what inspires you when you're at the funeral of someone you care deeply for, is that you respect and admire and love them because of not the kingdom and whatever they built. You see, the value of a life is always measured by how much of it's given away. And we love and respect these people because they figured out a way to leverage what they had for your sake. It's what inspires others. And imagine if all of us who called ourselves Christ followers, online as well, all of us who say, I follow Jesus, imagine if we all led that way. Imagine if we all lived that way. That kind of selflessness changed the world once. And perhaps it could change it again. You see, because I still believe that despite what's happening in this pandemic, despite what's happening with school, despite what's happening politically in the election, I still believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I still believe that this is what people want, that this is what people need. They need Jesus. They need Jesus. They need the King of Kings. They need to know that He leveraged all He had for them. But guess what? He left. And He told you and He told me, do as I have done for you, so that they will see me in you. You are Jesus, friend. You got real excited when I said He's the answer. You started clapping. But guess what? That's your responsibility. He lives in you. You are the light of the world. He hasn't done it to inspire us to cheer and to clap and to worship. Jesus died on a cross so that you would die to yourself too. And that you would leverage everything that He's given you. Not for you. Because it's not about you. It's not about me. For everyone else. Would you stand with me today? We're going to sing this song and allow God to do what He needs to do in this moment. Here's the one thing I do know. You can't live this way without Him. You are naturally selfish, not selfless. You come out of the womb wanting it your way. And the only way to live this out is to die to yourself and allow the Spirit of God to empower you to be who He's called you to be. That comes from being in the Word, worshiping, praying, doing all the things we do to build our spirit man. Because Jesus Himself said, He gave us this mandate, He gave us these commandments. But He said, if you disconnect from me, you ain't gonna be able to do it. Apart from me, you can do nothing of significance, nothing. But with me, connected to me, you can do anything. The disciples believed that to the point where they died for their faith in Jesus. You can do it too. We got to look to Him today, church. We need to ask for Him to give us His grace, His mercy, to give us His wisdom to live the life He's called us to live. Father,